Well, everyone, I think we'll get started as Sonia, our Hirt, our final panelist, joins us, and I'll just do the brief introduction. So I'm Renia Ehrenfeucht. I am the chair of the ACSP Committee on the Academy, and we are very happy to be hosting this panel today to really think about how the pandemic may be affecting our planning programs. That today we have 4 panelists joining us for this webinar. Sonia Hirt, who is the Dean of the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia. Jourdan, Executive Associate Dean, College of Architecture at Texas A&M University. Jennifer Cowley, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of North Texas. And Edward Feser, Provost at Oregon State University. So we wanted to, to have this discussion today about, numerous ways that this may that the pandemic may influence planning programs in general, and how we might kind of strategize and think about that. So I am hearing that so right now I'm getting that you cannot see or hear me. Can you hear me? Yes, to some. Can you see the panelist in a gallery view? That is who you should be seeing, and then Rolf and I are going to be co-hosting this event. And so and just a few things as we get started is that we do have kind of a chat box and a question and answer box. The question and answers, if you put in questions for the panelists, they'll be able to see them, and we will also kind of raise and ask some. And then the chat box we have open, if you want to just make a comment and you want to make a comment to everybody, but it may not be the form of a question. We also have a few poll questions, and as we get started, I am going to go ahead and launch this poll. And so we do encourage everybody to answer it. Don't worry if there's 2 people from the same university, we're just, kind of generally wanting to judge this, and I will share the responses once most of you have answered. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll right now. It has 3 questions, and I will just also read them quickly. The first is your department or program a net financial contributor to the university? At what level do budgeting decisions occur at your university? And then prior to the pandemic, how actively was your department or program planning for alternative teaching modes or non-traditional curricula? So I'm launching this now. And perhaps the order we were going to go was Sonia Hirt was going to be the first speaker, Jourdan, Jennifer Cowley, and then Edward Feser, but maybe we will just start, Dawn, with you, and then Sonia hopefully will have kind of joined us by the time you finish making your comments. So we've asked each panelist to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we will be kind of responding to questions, and I have some of the questions that you sent me already as well. All right, so Dawn.
All right, thanks for having me today. It's a real pleasure, and I hope to learn as many things as I share. So I serve as Executive Associate Dean for the College of Architecture at Texas A&M University. Our college is home to 3,200 students. So we're a big ship, but we're a big ship in a very large ocean at Texas A&M. Like you, we were impacted by COVID closures. We worked quickly over spring break to bring students home from study abroad. That's where our journey started, bringing students home from Italy, Spain, and Germany. Within 2 weeks, we were online and engaged in remote learning and working. It was a huge community effort. I cannot even begin to thank all of those people that were involved and the creativity they brought with them, particularly groups that like our IT departments, who really took the lead when we didn't know what the answers or even the questions were that we should be asking. Since then, probably like you, we have Zoomed ourselves silly. We have even done things like organizing drive-by parades to celebrate important milestones experienced by faculty and staff. So we work hard to build community, and we're working hard to keep our community vibrant. We've even been, like many of you, hosting faculty happy hours at the department and college level. And I will say that governance is at an all-time high because of some of these efforts that have brought us together. So I'm really proud of that. We are bringing people back to campus slowly as a mandate of the Chancellor. Texas opened very quickly. The university is a little more cautious. We'll be bringing people back in waves, starting with staff in just a week or so. Our classes are going to be online until fall, which has been a real challenge for us. Many of our programs have a mandatory study abroad program that takes place in the summer. So we've been trying to figure out an alternative experience that will be good for our students. In the fall, we're preparing to offer learning with appropriate social distance. We're not quite sure what that means yet, but that's where we're headed. We at least know what capacity our buildings can hold with social distance in mind. It's ironic that we had just completed our business continuity plan for the college before all of this happened. And based on this experience, we know exactly how it needs to be amended. So I think that's a good thing. Today, I'd like to talk with you about 3 things that strike me as important to this conversation, and they're at the very micro level. The first one is budget cuts. Then I'd like to talk with you about student recruitment, and finally, shared governance. So I've had the privilege of being both student and faculty at a number of large public institutions. I was at the University of Kansas, Florida State, the University of Florida, the University of Oklahoma, and then Texas A&M. At each institutions, I have memories of or experiences with small and large economic shocks that required some level of budget cut or reallocation. So in some ways, the world we're living in is not new to us. It just comes in a different form. Based on these experiences, I feel like in some way we're always planning for the next budget cut, or that we should be. We should be ready to be resilient. Why? Well, we're planners. Our colleges are driven by strategic plans, as are universities. Our budgets are living, breathing documents, like those strategic plans. And the two have to be interrelated, just as we tell our students that comprehensive plans, zoning ordinances, and capital improvements plans should be connected. These budgets, these strategic plans force us to commoditize our efforts and to identify our priorities, those that pay for themselves and those that are so important to us that we're willing to subsidize them. I know that all of you have these efforts that are so important to your learning that you figure out a way to ensure that the experience continues because it's good for your students, your college, and the program. Sometimes it's not that experience that generates the revenue that pays for it, but you look for partners through development at the university, through the generation of student credit hours in other capacities to make sure that you can do things like engaged learning. This is critical to our discipline. I think that's important for us to think about as we go through the budget cut, that it's not just about how are we going to defend what we do now, but it is forcing us to look at what are we doing, how important is it to us? If it's important to us and we're not doing it at the level we'd like to, where are we going to shift money from to make sure that we can continue to do it? How are we going to change our businesses, our practices, our efforts to make sure that we stay vital? And I know that Ed and Jennifer will address some bigger issues at the university level, and I'll leave it at that. But I think we should always be able to use the strategic plan and the budget to justify who we are and what we do. And if we have difficulty doing that, then we need to rethink what is sacred, what is important about what we offer. This takes us to student numbers. At a lot of universities, mine included, the generation of student credit hours is so important. And you only generate student credit hours if you have students. Right now, universities across the country are really worried about fall numbers. In Texas, we're particularly worried about this because it's a counting year, and the legislature is going to look at our enrollment to determine our budget allocation. It's important to me as an associate dean that we can demonstrate to our provosts that enrollment is stable and on a positive trajectory, because they're looking to the colleges to figure out what are you doing to ensure that your programs are viable in the short and long term. For some programs, this is really easy. In my own college, the waiting list for programs like construction, science, and visualization are really long. All of the students seem to want to come and make animation with us, right? There's a real priority and a value for that. Other disciplines have to aggressively recruit. This isn't necessarily because of the quality of the programs, it's just that programs like ours, as you all already know, planning programs have often been a best kept secret. And it's been hard to communicate who we are, what we do to bring students to us. This has been such a challenge that ACSP recently commissioned a task force to look at the issue of marketing and recruiting and made recommendations to all of the sister schools. This issue is more important now due to COVID because we worry that students will delay coming back to school if they have to do it remotely. We're also worried about our admitted international students, that they may be delayed in coming back because they're not able to get visas in time. This threat is real. So these concerns, we can either be paralyzed by them or they can lead us to innovation. And right now I'd like to celebrate the work of our Associate Dean of Graduate Programs. She's new to her job, but proposed the idea of doing a college-wide quick admit program for graduate students. This would mean that any student at Texas A&M who had recently graduated could apply for one of our graduate programs if they had a certain GPA threshold without going through the formal admissions process. These applications are still reviewed. They're not automatic admit, but they're a quicker process. This process, working with the department heads and the program coordinators, was put together in 2 weeks' time. That means the graduate programs figured out how to market their program, to whom they would want to market their program, what kind of requirements that they would have, and a website was generated so that we could encourage students who might be graduating and having a difficult time finding a job but were really interested in pursuing advanced education so that they could come join us. At this point, just after a few weeks' time, we have a list of 70 students who may join us in the fall, depending on the success of their applications. What's ironic is now some of our programs are worried that they'll have too many students in the fall. Generally, this is a wonderful problem to have. When you're talking about learning with social distancing, it is a little bit challenging, but still very exciting that small efforts can make such a big difference when you're thinking about recruitment. And then finally, I wanted to make a couple of comments on governance and the budgeting process. Generally, you should not make a plan to address a budget cut in a dark room by yourself. That's probably something that I don't even need to say to this group of people. It is likely that you, as a department head, as a leader at your university, know the budget better than anyone else. But your stakeholders are going to be impacted by the decisions you make. They can even be enraged. Now, normally they wouldn't really even be interested in the conversation about the budget until it's happened. I wanted to tell you a little story of my own experience. When I arrived at Texas A&M, the university asked us to do a reallocation in the name of excellence. So each college was asked to give a little bit of money back to the university so it could be awarded as part of an excellence initiative. It was possible that the college would get its own money back. However, one of the conditions of the reallocation was that we were to target an area that we were not doing particularly well at. We had just come off a strategic planning retreat. Our college's leadership team, deans and department heads had identified concerns about space. We had doubled in size in a decade's time by population, but we're still in the same space. And so we targeted a space, which in that case was our technical reference center and interior library in our college. And we decided that by giving up the space and some of the things that went with it for learning, teaching, and all the other things that we had to do, that this reallocation could make sense for us. No one was fired. We figured out other places to move people. The books were rehoused to the extent possible, but the space was lost to the primary users. And in this case, that was students. I'm not proud to say that the decision-making process, which happened in 2 weeks' time, did not consult faculty or students. And you can imagine the outcome of the failure in the participatory process. We've learned, we've pledged to do better. At Texas A&M, we've been asked to take a 7.5% cut over the next 2 years, and the college is splitting this cut with the departments. So the college is working together with its leadership team to find those things that we're spending too much on that we can do without, that we can wait for to remove from our budget. We have a very savvy chief financial officer who really keeps a finger on the pulse of the ability to do that. The departments are working with their faculty much closer to make the cuts. In my own department, the head there has skillfully reviewed the budget with her team and made a recommendation to the faculty that I believe is palatable. Dr. Van Zant, the department head there, experienced the same thing I did when I discussed the budget with our college leadership team, and that was a bit of radio silence. So I believe that the radio silence, the crickets, as you would call them, can be attributed to the fact that while budgets are typically publicly available to all at all levels, it's still scary, it's still mysterious, and it's still of theoretically little interest to people when the money is flowing smoothly. So the question becomes, how do we get people more involved in our practices? And I think the answer lies somewhat in what I said when I began, that I think the strategic plan has to be directly aligned and correlated with the budget, so that when we make a decision to shift funds or to shift priorities, we know what it means in terms of cost. And that way we know the real value of what we need, what we do, the money that is made and given back to us based on that information. And then we can make decisions that are data driven, which is what we do in our research and teach our students to do into the communities. So it's a bit of living more formally some of the things that we do. I look forward myself at getting better at engaging the faculty in governance, so that whenever we're making a decision, it's not like we're looking at the budget for the first time, but it's like we're returning to an old friend, if you will, that will help guide us in the decisions that we make. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dawn. And next we will have Sonia Hirt, but before I am going to share the results of the poll with everybody. So you should be seeing that in just a moment. And then Sonia, please, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you, everyone, and wonderful comments, Dawn. I will attempt not to repeat. Thank you to the Committee of the Academy for this wonderful initiative, and my apologies that I, for some reason, had difficulty joining in. Perfect illustration, as always, that in person is better. But anyway, it's a necessary stage. So we are in a tough position in our college, as are most colleges, all colleges in the country. We are a relatively small college. We also have landscape architecture and historic preservation in addition to urban design and planning. And the programs are very strongly integrated, and planning is really benefit from this connection that we have with preservation and landscapes, which, you know, is relatively unique. It's not true for every built environment college around the country. So we have this long-term asset, excellent faculty, excellent students, wonderful staff, but we are faced with the same, well, don't use the word old friend, but privately, I feel that it's more like the old enemy, the budget. In our case, we're being asked to come up with scenarios that vary between 8 and 12%. So it's very significant. And, you know, we're talking about, I don't know whether that's lucky for us or not, but we have 5 retirements and I'm possibly looking at replacing 1. 2 is a dream, and, you know, potentially 0. And I totally agree that this is in alliance with the strategic plan. Whether this is an opportunity or a problem, I don't know, but we were just in the process of submitting our strategic plan to the university. And now it appears that we may have to rethink significant portions of it. So I can't pretend that it has been a very happy time from, you know, professionally or personally for anyone. But the way I make sense of it and the way I wake up in the morning being mildly unhappy and I can get myself back to happiness by the end of the day is that I somewhere deep inside, I don't know whether this is data driven or emotionally driven, but have a feeling that this could be short term. And when I say short term, I'm not making a prediction of whether the global crisis will be short term. That is above my pay grade. I'm just talking about, there is, I think, an immediate crisis to planning departments that comes from these budgets and also from, I think at least in our case, somewhat of an assumption among our colleagues that, is urban planning is with landscape architecture? Is this along with the arts? Is this related to STEM? Is it really the future of the world? Can we get away without it? So this is, I think, a short-term problem. But here is why I think that in the long term, it may actually be a good way for us to rethink what we do. So in the medium term, I think it allows us to revisit some assumptions that I think we've had with us for a long time, but you know, now I think is the time to question them. So in my college, at least, because we are very heavily studio driven, it's of course very important to have this interaction between teams of students, individual students, and the faculty. And for a very long time, you know, most people believe that it is simply not going to be possible to transfer the studio, the planning studio and the landscape architecture studio online. Well, you know, I hate to be cliche, but, you know, necessity is the mother of all invention. It turned out that all the studios could actually transition and relatively smoothly with fairly good student teaching evaluations at the end of the day. So what we thought may be difficult, impossible, compromising quality because of the efforts of the faculty and the patience and wisdom of the students was actually possible. And I think this is actually going to open opportunities for us to transition online parts of the programs or potentially entire programs if necessary. And we were forced into that. And otherwise, you know, it would have taken us many years to come up with a proposal how to switch something to online. But I think now we actually saw that a short-term horizon is quite doable. It lets us reconsider many things that are debated in our profession. I mean, what is a planning program? How important is accreditation? Our planning program is a very rigorous planning program, and it's nearly 60 credits. Well, they're programs for 30 credits. Is this something that's we should change, or does this moment in time actually only confirm this initial conviction that our faculty had that no, we are a rigorous program and this is what is required. And we are now, I feel we are much more active participant in various debates that exist at the university of actually creating stackable programs. I mean, one of the things I think we do well is design thinking, which is a very fashionable term. Everyone uses it, and often you see it in universities is not taught by designers. Well, we are considering a university initiative that includes design thinking, and suddenly our relevance, I think, became more apparent to university administration than it was before. So yes, it looks very grim in the short term, and I think Dawn is absolutely right saying that you can soften the blow by having a better process, a process that involves more participation rather than less, time permitting. You know, we only had a 10-day period of time to submit a proposed new budget, but time permitting. But in the medium term, there are some opportunities, but I think the most, and I hate to use the word exciting because it seems, you know, I mean, that I should temper it down somehow, but I think still in the long term, there is an opportunity to consider what planners do and also explain to others what planners do. And I agree with Dawn, and I think most of us in this room would agree that one of the problems of planning is that people are not quite sure what it is outside of the profession. I mean, if you go to a room with, you know, 18-year-olds and their parents, and I mean, how many of them say, well, I just want to be an urban planner? I mean, frankly, there haven't been enough movies with an urban planner being the chief character in Hollywood. So it isn't as obvious what people do. And so there is this inherent and always present marketing problem. But I am inspired, so to say, by two things which I think can help us overcome this problem. And strangely, and I want to be cynical about this, I don't want to say that the crisis is an opportunity, but at least it's an invitation to reconsider. So there are two things. I think until just a few months ago, it was perfectly possible to review articles in which the author would claim that correctly, that urban planning was legitimized initially, at least in the United States, as a profession very much grounded in concerns for health, public health. And I reviewed several articles for my own journal in which in the middle of article was explained that because of the eventual going away of contagious diseases, there was this separation that occurred in the mid-20th century until recently between health and planning. Well, guess what? Famous last words. The contagious diseases did not disappear. They just came in a different form. And so the planning historian part of me is attracted by this idea that I realized over the last maybe 2 decades, there has been a lot of research restoring this connection between health and planning. But I think this is a conversation between us. And now we actually have the opportunity to explain to others that really this is health and planning are very tightly integrated fields. So in that sense, I think maybe we'll take a short-term cut, whether it's in numbers, budget numbers, or student numbers, and the two are obviously the same. But even conceptually, so we have to, I think we have to think big and conceptually consider our field again, so that we actually do better job of teaching content. And I think by doing this, we should attract students because we just do a better job analyzing, sharing information, provoking new thoughts, and so forth and so forth. And the other thing I think is very tricky, and it could be, you know, what I'm saying would be mildly controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I think this is the point. We need to talk to each other, is that there are hundreds now of media pieces that are predicting that people will be afraid to live in cities, that they will move to suburban areas, that suburbs will be the new cool thing as they were, you know, not that a few decades ago. It doesn't help that the governor of the state of New York would say that the problem why New York has so many infections is because of density. I mean, frankly, for many years, we have thought as density as something super important for innovation. So there appears to be a lot of pressure to potentially rethink that. And I know it's tricky and it's difficult because it's causing us to rethink our assumptions. But on the other hand, I think it's a real opportunity because I think we can say with certainty that most people agree that density, cities, urbanism are things necessary for innovation and progress, however you define progress. But must the other side of the coin be a greater public health threat? Must it be that way? Is it the same? And I think this is the key role of the design fields and the policy fields and planning. If we can design and create policies for cities so that we can, in essence, reap the benefits, but don't have a negative other side of the coin, I think that really is the real contribution that planners can implement in these very difficult conditions. So my invitation to all is to worry about the budgets, but at the same time, take a step back and rethink why we are here to begin with and why we believed in planning in the first time. And if I think that this is for us also a way toward the future, toward greater enrollments and greater relevance of what we do in society. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Thank you very much. And now Jennifer Cowley.
Hi, and I don't know why my virtual background is going a little crazy. I'll see if I can do something about fixing that. But I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what is going on the national landscape and the influences that are going to impact our budgets and the financial situation for the upcoming year and beyond. So what I'll say is that, of course, the landscape isn't very good. So Ed and I are spending a lot of time talking with each other about what's happening on the national stage in terms of our own state budgets and things of that nature. So in my own state, in Texas, we have been told to plan for 5% and 10% budget cuts by the state that could go into effect this fall. That seems to be a pretty popular number in state legislatures across the board. And we're also finding that there are a number of situations where we're also facing university budget cuts. And those university budget cuts are being driven by a couple of different factors. One, international enrollment. We're projecting that international enrollment will go down in the fall because people will not be able to get visas. Depending on the country that you're in, the immigration offices aren't projected to open for some period of time. That will impact students' ability to get to the U.S. Second, retention numbers. Some students may not be comfortable or feel that they want to come back to whatever the situation is that we're going to deliver in the fall, whether that be remote or in person. And then we have new students. Some freshmen may want to take a gap year rather than come to what our universities may be experiencing. And so all of us are coming up with a range of scenarios. And the difficulty is that we don't know what the exact target needs to be at an institutional level because there's too many unknowns driving what the budget situation is going to be for the fall semester. At my own institution, I asked all of the colleges to plan for 5, 10, and 15% budget scenarios, and I've already implemented a 5% budget cut for next year. And then that ranges at the college level from a 2 to an 8% budget cut. And I've told them this is the first step. I may be coming back in August and asking for a deeper cut depending on what the situation is moving forward. Now that obviously directly impacts instructional budgets. So I've said to everyone, we need to take a serious look at workload allocation. And I know that's not a popular phrase in departments, and faculty don't want to be asked to do more work. So how do we think about redistribution of work? So I've asked everybody to look at the service load for next year. What committees do we not need under these circumstances? Who can just make decisions? We don't really need an awards committee. Somebody can just pick the awards for 1 year. Those kinds of things that we need to look at because we will have cuts in the adjunct budgets. We will be cutting certain kinds of sections that are enrollment driven, but we also still have core curriculum that has to be delivered. And so that means that some faculty are going to have to pick up an extra class this year in order to make that possible. Now, how departments adapt under the current circumstances is really interesting. The thing that I have been very pleasantly surprised by is the enrollment numbers for summer. At my own institution, summer enrollment is up 10% in student credit hours. And I'm hearing numbers nationally that vary from 5 to 25% up. And I know that is directly driven because in the past, we have not had as many remote or online classes available in the summertime. It's also driven by students' internship plans and study abroad plans and other things being disrupted. But I think there's a significant opportunity to increase student credit hour enrollment in planning programs because the curriculum you're delivering has a high level of interest, but tends to be fairly inflexible and less accessible than other types of programming across the university. Now, another factor is most planning programs are pretty expensive. Not as expensive as some programs in the university, but since they're largely graduate driven, they tend to cost more in order to deliver than some other kinds of programming. So understanding, and I appreciated the poll questions at the beginning, that a significant number of you are not aware of whether or not you're a net contributor or not to the university. When it comes to budget cuts don't come proportionally across the institution. And so understanding how you're financially contributing to the bottom line of the university is something that's really important, and that you think about how can you position your program most strongly to show positive benefits. What is the impact that you're having on the university? And I noted earlier someone in the Q&A had posted the downward trend in planning programs. We're seeing a downward trend in all programs that are two-year master's programs. The two-year master's programs are something that is not highly desirable in the current marketplace. Students are choosing one year plus kinds of programs. And I know the Planning Accreditation Board certainly has an influence over that, but our accreditation standards, I would argue, are outdated for the kinds of educational delivery that our students are looking for. And I would also argue, if you look at the growth of online programs in planning, that we've seen some significant success in those programs. And so the ability for students to be able to pursue graduate education in an online format is something that planning programs should certainly be considering. How might they do that? And I know that certainly impacts the studio model and much of the experiential learning that we have in our planning programs. But I think what we're learning through the COVID crisis, and certainly as we head into fall semester with many of our courses being forced into a remote delivery, is that we can design our education in a different way. That there are ways that we can be more flexible and relevant and find ways to reach what our students need in the most accessible way possible. And given that we're short on time, I want to make sure Ed has time to jump in and you can build off of what I've been talking about, and then we'll have some time for Q&A.
Thank you. Now, Ed, Feser?
Yeah, just let me add a few more comments. Thanks everybody for joining today, and thanks also for having me here. I'll just try to give a little bit of a Provost perspective, add a little bit to Jennifer's comments, and I want to keep it very brief, but let me just make a couple of really high-level points for those of you particularly sitting in department chair seats and thinking about how to navigate the current budget situation, but maybe looking forward as well. I think Chris Nelson's question in the chat or the Q&A is a really good one. If you were on a downward trend going into the current situation, the real question on the mind of your dean and your provost is going to be what will be different coming out of it. And I think when you think about what's, what is motivating the thinking at higher levels about where to put scarce resources, you have to keep a couple of things in mind. And Don mentioned it earlier, that one of the most important is enrollment. And it is not necessarily just major enrollment in your discipline, but it may also be your non-major enrollment in your other courses that are serving the university at large. It's just a fact of life that in universities today, where for most of our public institutions, particularly 7 out of 8 or 7 out of $10 typically are coming from tuition directly, and most of the other dollars are coming indirectly via distribution models from the state that are based on your enrollment levels. So, faculty don't always like to hear that because it's frustrating, especially if you can't get your enrollments up. But the reality is that's kind of the world we're in more and more now, especially, well, both it has been in privates, but it now is in publics. And of course, we also know if we do the math well, that funded research is a money loser overall for the university. We generally, of course, we do it, especially those of us in research intensive institutions, it's our mission. But I've seen many units imagine that their funded research was actually a net positive for the university when It is almost never a net positive. There are too many other costs associated with it that are shared broadly across the institution. Again, we do it because it's our mission, but you can't confuse yourself about the underlying economics. So enrollment becomes really, really, really important. And then net revenue relative to your, what I call technology, apologies for the economics term, but a music department is expected to cost you a lot more than a social sciences oriented unit. A design oriented unit will cost you more. And you kind of, those of us in these roles know what those are. So when units are very high cost in net revenue terms relative to their technology, that's usually because they're not doing some things that they could otherwise do. For example, teach courses more broadly to the larger campus that are appealing to students. The question and answer in the chat worries me a little, to be candid, because so many planning programs, and I directed one and then served as a dean with a planning program in the college. And of course, we worked on these issues at that, there too, in the former institution I was in, but it worries me to see the low active attention around online and other modalities. Because when you're facing the long-term enrollment challenges that planning programs have, you've really got to you've really got to address that, and you've got to address it fast. It's been going on too long. And I do think a lot of our challenges in planning could be, especially when we're talking about two-year master's programs, are difficult for people to decamp for college towns for 2 years and absorb the cost of that. We kind of know that's hard for students to do unless we're in a metro area. And yet we haven't really changed as a discipline to create more creative options for students to complete. Or enough of our programs haven't done that. We should be worried about that. So the pace of change has to go up. I know it's hard to get, you work as a faculty and you've got to make decisions together, but the reality is, especially for programs that are facing soft enrollment kinds of challenges, they just have to change faster. And I think that's evident, particularly in this pandemic. Last 2 points I want to end with. One is your substantive value as a unit really isn't compelling to the university. And the only way I can say that, it sounds terrible to say, every discipline at the institution is compelling. And what I often see units do is come and make a case based on, the work we do is really important. And it is really important, but so is everybody else's. And they all have really good arguments for why their work is really important. Certainly, increasing share of the population lives in cities, many challenges. City planners are addressing. The work of city planners is critically important, but so are so many other disciplines. And the reason I mention that is because what you don't want to waste a lot of your time on is trying to convince your dean or your provost that you matter because of the substantive nature of your work. You've got to put yourself in the shoes of the broader institution and ask yourself, how are we going to make this both viable and distinctive? And the last kind of point there is that distinction is everything, and it always is everything. So even though I led with enrollment, it's always set on a foundation of whether or not you're doing really quality work relative to the mission of the institution. If you're in an R1 on a scholarly level, is it of high quality? If you're in a teaching institution, that you're delivering with innovative pedagogy and excelling in the teaching instructional mission. So it's going to vary by institution, but the fact is distinction still comes down to it. Sometimes people say to me, well, you just want us to chase credit hours. Not at all. But what you want to do is create a distinctive scholarly and instructional program that is serving enough students that it can be justified relative to many, many other programs that are trying to do the same thing. And that's kind of how you have to frame it. I just realized one more point. We are planning like never before at the institutional level. All day long, every day, all I do is plan right now. Many, many, many units across the campus are doing so. I hope that you're really engaged in that at some level with your universities. If you're not, I think you should get engaged, because you know, when I hear people now, as I go into these pandemic planning meetings, and we've got multiple task forces and contingency planning exercises going on all over the institution, and I know from talking to other provosts, the same thing at every university around the country, you know, the work of planners could lend a lot of insight right now at the table. It would have to be really nimble, and people would have to be ready to work a lot of hours and take on extra service to do it. But, you know, when I sort of regret not having a planning program here, well, I do regret it because I'm a city planner here at Oregon State, but the fact is many of you have so much to bring to the challenge we face at the institution. So hopefully you're at the table in some of those conversations. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And now we are going to be just responding to questions. So continue to put them forward in the Q&A. And I received some questions from chairs in advance. And then one is, has just been touched on. So the question of enrollment, and then Jim Spencer has raised it here again, is kind of historically for state formula funding, recognize that graduate education cost more than undergraduate education. But as states, or as our state institutions receive less funding from the state, how should we be thinking about undergraduate education in relationship to our accredited master's programs or doctoral education? And this is for all the panelists.
Well, I can perhaps jump in on Jim's question related to undergraduate enrollments and the opportunities there. So both at Ohio State and at the University of North Texas was part of projects to launch undergraduate programs. In both cases, those were highly successful and significant enrollment numbers. And that completely changed the contributions of the planning programs to the institution as a whole and created a much stronger fiscal balance and was able to generate a lot of student credit hours, because undergraduate students are more likely to take classes that are outside of their major as part of their undergraduate education, even if they're majoring in another discipline. So I think that that is a big opportunity for planning programs. You already have the expertise to be able to do more at the undergraduate level. So I'll pause with that one and just say I think that that's a great space for people to jump into.
Other thoughts from the panelists?
Well, I guess I would just add, I would certainly think about it. I'd be careful about doing it. You know, you definitely want to do it with your overall strategic plan for your unit in mind. But one trend I think we're going to see is that we are going to be able to teach more complicated content to people earlier in their academic careers than we did before. In the case of OSU and many other institutions, we're seeing students come in with a lot of accelerated credit. I don't think it'll be very long before you see 3-year degrees at the undergraduate level. Do we really need to take 4 years? That's you know, a question a lot of people are asking. So then one might ask yourself, if you're planning, the other dynamic I'd add is the students are really vocationally oriented today. They really want something that's quite tangible and practical in many cases, and planning has that to offer, as well as having often a very good theoretical and social science foundation. So I kind of wonder, not, you know, the first place I like to start is kind of the substance. I think a lot of programs could offer very good undergraduate programs that would be of value in preparing people for careers. And so just from that standpoint, it seems to me to be something that units should be thinking more about. And it will definitely, a successful undergraduate program will underpin a successful graduate program. There's no question about that from a fiscal standpoint.
Thank you. And Rolf, were you going to ask the next question?
Yeah, I'll unmute myself and maybe start my video. Can you all see me?
Yes.
Okay. So this was actually also a question from Lakshmi about the PAB, the current PAB response to the crisis. We're going through the accreditation process right now. We got an extra 2 weeks to hand in our self-study report, but I haven't heard anything from anyone on the PAB board about whether there's consideration of really quickly rethinking some things like the residency requirements, especially that. But so this has been a question, like if the incentive structure were there, as an administrator of both a bachelor's and a master's program that are accredited, I'd be interested to hear from the PAB whether the conversation there seems to think it's as, that the standards are as problematic as the panelists have raised here, or if anybody wants to stick up for them in this forum. Do we have a way for people to raise their hands and contribute?
No, the way that it's structured through UNM is that unfortunately attendees cannot be unmuted.
Okay, so if someone has chat to give to that, that'd be great. But if anybody among the panel has any insight about the current situation with PAB, I'd be delighted to hear any input I can give.
I have not heard anything directly from PAB, but I would say, and I think the panelists would probably agree from a previous discussion, that it's critical that our accrediting body starts working with us to move in these directions, because the market is changing, our students are changing. The COVID crisis has forced us to be different and more creative than we have been in the past. And so in the future, we will require changes in the way that we deliver planning degrees. Otherwise, I can foresee a lot of planning programs not being accredited or making a choice not to be accredited so that they can continue to educate students, but in a different format and in a different way.
Yeah, I would just add to that, accreditation exists because we as a set of institutions accept it as important and valuable. And Lou Hopkins used to say at Illinois, accreditation is us. And we can influence that if we choose to. And so I would just encourage the leadership of ACSP and just, now may be a time to take proposals to PAB about making changes if those are seen as barriers. The other point I'll make is, accreditation often doesn't have the kind of, it's not quite as restrictive as people often imagine going in. But so be really careful you understand the standards and the flexibility there. But I would not, PAB is going to have to change or it will make itself irrelevant.
So I saw an interesting question posed by Nisha about opportunities for remote instruction online delivery. And one of the things that I would just encourage planning departments to think about is, now that we're all in a Zoom and remote world, it makes co-teaching across institutions far easier. So Tom Sanchez at Virginia Tech and I co-taught a course together while I was at Ohio State online. We both offered our sections on our independent campuses, had control in Canvas or whatever platform people are using to our students, but then we jointly delivered the instruction through a shared platform. And you could certainly think about the expertise that we have on our campuses, and given the constraints we'll have on adjunct teaching budgets, that this is an opportunity to pick up some of those specialized areas across institutions and share coursework potentially, reducing costs on both sides. So that's one creative short-term way that you might be able to expand and stretch your instructional capacity.
Well, and I'd like to kind of tie that into another question that I received prior to this, but also tie it into then thinking about the budgeting, and that is about how departments can contingency plan. And so thinking about both financially, that there's a lot of unknown going forward, and then looking at like what level do the budgeting decisions occur on the poll results, that I think many departments don't feel like they have a lot of control over that. And so then there's challenges, the idea of monetizing a strategic plan if you don't feel like you have control over your budget, but then also thinking about the questions of curriculum. And so any of the panelists' thoughts on how to think about contingency planning, but also thinking of it from a budgetary side, but also some innovative ideas like Jennifer was just mentioning, what might be some elements of that thinking that, that might help us kind of think about how to innovate in planning programs in the future, as well as sort of addressing a financial crunch that may come. Any and all thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't know that I have a perfect answer exactly on the question, but I want to second some of the thoughts that were already said. So we do not have an undergraduate planning program, but in the absence of it, I think the way that we begin thinking about our curriculum is how to design courses that appeal to the business student, and how to design courses that are appealing to the engineering student, which in our case are just the bigger schools. So we've reached out to the other deans, associate deans, and we're doing some direct surveys with student groups in other colleges. And we are trying to bump our credit hour production, not necessarily by creating an undergraduate program, but ultimately making a case that we know things that they do not, and they would never know unless they take a course with us. And I'm saying this, and there has been some level of moderate success. So as Ed was saying, I mean, planners happen to be really well educated in a number of fields, and it's not universally known. And so within our own university, I think one way that we can overcome the budget problems is that we need to teach content that it is not, we don't think about it this way. How can I make my own students know more about business, which is a great idea, and we should do that. But if students enter a real estate specialization as we have in the business school, they might actually exit the university and have never taken a course that actually is about physical planning. So what would we contribute to business? And I think within at least the large universities where planning programs are usually small, I think this is, one very simple thing to do. As to the monetizing of the strategic plan, I totally agree. We, as I said, had a perfectly, it was like a complete draft. I just could not press the submit button. And, a couple months ago, and then, we were given an extension, and now I'm thinking that without monetizing it, actually, it's not going to really be a strategic plan. So no, I didn't think of it that way, but, I think this is the way of the future.
I guess one thing I'd add on contingency planning is to identify those decisions you've talked about as a faculty that are really difficult and have been hard to make, but you need to do. Right? We all have been in departments where we say, we really got to fix X, or an online option of X kind could be really valuable. It's hard to get anybody's attention focused on that. Everybody's busy. You could think of what they are. The remote learning that we're doing with Zoom has opened up amazing possibilities, really, if you think about it, and they've been referenced already, to draw more expertise into our programs, to tap practitioners around the world to contribute to our programs, to share courses at the doctoral level, to deliver better courses that are highly specialized that many units have trouble doing because they're so small. Put those on the table and lay out a plan that is proactively addressing the budget challenge in your unit, and if you have a long-running enrollment challenge, addressing that and take it to your dean. I can tell you that the number of times units brought me very strong plans with difficult decisions that they knew had to be made. I got lots of plans from units where they didn't make the difficult decisions, and they were hoping with some budget injection they could avoid making them. And I get the same thing from colleges as a provost. Some of them just like lay the issues out, face them, bring them to you, say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. If I can, get approval for this or support for that, I will execute on these hard decisions. Those are the ones you invest in. And then there are those that basically are trying to not really make the hard decision because it creates tension in the unit or it's hard calls, those are the ones you leave aside because you've got to invest in the former. So I would just encourage now is a really good time to step back and say, okay, your contingency planning is really keyed around hard decisions that you knew you needed to take or opportunities you probably should have captured, but they were hard to do because everybody was busy. So now try to take those on. It'll create a little bit more certainty for yourself. But I would think this new remote learning option just creates tremendous opportunity for professionally oriented programs like city planning.
I might offer as well, we've talked a lot about state funding and student credit hour generation and budgets that come within the frameworks that we're used to. But sometimes crisis is a remarkable time to launch interesting capital campaigns for specific projects. With the economy in flux as it is, sometimes those funds aren't readily available right away. But it is an opportunity to start working with stakeholders and to let them know what the threats are to programs or to pieces of programs that they really value, and to raise private monies to support those ventures long term.
So I wanted to elevate Xenia's point from the chat, which is that the PAB would like to hear about standards that are deemed problematic, and that program administrators should be active in sending proposals for change to PAB Executive Director Just Marie Johnson. I'd like to take this up with the rest of the committee on the Academy, which is the sort of the initiator of these webinars, before I make this offer firmly. But it seems that perhaps in the interest of reducing the number of emails that that she gets and the PAB gets about this issue now, we might reach out to you again and offer to aggregate some of your concerns and share them more broadly, so that if we can do that with pretty quick turnaround, hopefully they can really take a hard look at some aggregated comments, and if anyone has amendments or tweaks to make on anything we would report, you can just let us know or say so directly to her. So this is, it's a tentative proposal made on the fly, and we'll have to get back to you about that. Nisha Bachway asked the question, can you discuss opportunities to offer remote instruction or online delivery for key planning courses that may be able to reach more students beyond the planning boundaries? This remote instruction is key across the board at Georgia Tech, but also sort of generally. So one thing that I've heard about, and I'd like the panelists to take on, is that in some disciplines, there has been collaboration among small groups, networked groups of instructors from multiple institutions who aren't necessarily saying, I'll teach your class this day if you teach my class that day, but rather they're trying to develop high quality content together, so that if I'm instructing on a topic one day, but I'm not so deep in it, then I can call on you for part of the lecture, and I can engage with my students around discussions on that. So it creates some solidarity and also deepens the experience and allows people to spend more time developing really good content. So that's just, it's one idea or an example of ways in which we've seen some of those efforts happen. And I'm wondering whether anything at your institutions has been happening to promote or foster that kind of collaboration across units and across institutions in online course development.
At A&M, we do a lot of courtesy appointments across the colleges, and this has provided a really nice place for faculty to come together and do just what you have said. For example, I have a joint appointment in the College of Law, and on occasion, when I teach the land use law class for the planners, we'll open the class up and I'll teach the law students as well. They're not on campus, they're in Fort Worth, so we have to do that remotely. But the technology, especially the technology we have now, really permits that. The other thing that we're exploring, we have a lot of graduate certificate programs in our college, and we're looking at ways to put that coursework online to reach a broader base of audience, to bring them into the college and to bring other experiences to them that way.
So we're doing exactly the same thing. We are looking at the existing curriculum, and even without adding new courses, I think there are several options with packaging existing courses, and without maybe developing one new course or two, but not a huge range, that we can offer certificates that, as I said, are attractive to business and engineering students. In my opinion, and I guess, you know, different universities do it differently, but the biggest obstacle to collaborating in teaching, in our case, across colleges, is that the whole student credit hour production model does not quite encourage it. You know, you have to count parts of a course, and in our case, the unit, the primary instructor gets the credit, whatever college they are in. And so that has not helped collaboration, but I'd be, you know, eager to know about whether other universities do it differently, and that creates a more collaborative environment.
What I'm talking about is more like a creative workaround to this issue, rather than, you know, splitting up the credits, understanding that everybody's got to deliver our core courses next year, and knowing that we may be asking new faculty or adjuncts to teach core courses online, and, you know, asking an adjunct instructor to deliver a core course online, that's a really huge ask. So thinking about that, you know, the question was really, are there mechanisms that allow your units and your instructors still to be the instructional home of record, while capitalizing on sort of more the economy of scale of having a bunch of people collaborating on one course, each of them being responsible for the delivery in their unit of that one course. This is, I was trying to use it as an example, but it seems like a workaround that gets at both some of Dawn's question. It sort of goes beyond, I think, Dawn's question to going among institutions, not just in colleges. But this is something that was interesting to me, and I was wondering if anybody tried it, and if you could see any way to incentivize that kind of, or enable that kind of collaboration among the instructors in units, especially when some of those folks are adjuncts who aren't networked real well in to existing core instruction modes and the networks we have in ACSP.
I'm not really sure how to incentivize it, Rolf. It seems like the opportunity you're posing there is of greatest potential across institutions. So the kind of example you suggested, a specialized course, or maybe a core course that's shared among 4 different institutions in effect. So the credit hours for your particular institution are accruing to your unit, and for theirs, but you're sharing that teaching delivery. I think that's really interesting. One of the things that might give you additional capability, we're probably not the only institution doing it. We're in the middle of putting webcam and microphone and other technology in all of our classrooms across the university. And the notion is that, you know, we're worried most immediately that some students will not be able to attend classes in the fall, or will be socially distancing, so that we've got classrooms half full. Some will be online, some will be in the classroom, but hopefully. But going forward, this will give us enormous capability to do exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. And for planning, where it's difficult for every program to have specialists, you could have very enriching courses by creating shared models like that. And I'm not sure you'd really need necessarily any external incentive for that, other than the ability to have such a compelling offer that it makes your program that much more attractive.
And I'd like to draw attention to Ryan's question about the cost of education, because one of the responses to declining budgets has been differential tuition. And he asks, how should we be thinking about student loan forgiveness issue? And are there creative ways that planning schools are reducing the cost to students as a way to address enrollment issues? So thoughts on the opposite of what we have a tendency to do, which is say we'll increase differential tuition in order to bring revenue directly towards our unit.
I think Ed and I would probably agree that there is going to be extreme price sensitivity in the near term, and that some states are looking at rolling back tuition increases. The odds that any of us are going to be in a position to go forward with any significant tuition increases in the next year is going to be fairly limited. So while that might be an important part of long-term planning, it's probably not a short-term solution, although I defer to Ed on his thoughts on this subject.
Problem with tuition reduction is when you do the math, to net out positive, you usually have to have an enormous increase in enrollment. So the price sensitivity isn't there, or hasn't been there historically. That said, I think we're going to have I predict a kind of cataclysmic change in how we price education, higher education. We're seeing it now. I would be very surprised if we get through the fall without universities under extreme pressure to reduce non-resident tuition for students on remote learning. It's just right now the universities are all kind of holding the line, but somebody is going to break ranks, and they're going to change their model. But I think in the long run, what we're likely to see emerge is a student's education is going to be a combination of synchronous online, like we're doing with Zoom, asynchronous online, as we've delivered much conventional online instruction, which is often more and more designed to a very high standard. Our online classes in our eCampus are very high quality offerings. We have 90 plus personnel who just who basically spend their time working with faculty to develop online options. We have a very large online program here, but I think others are going to follow suit. And then face-to-face. So a student's going to go through university with face-to-face, online, asynchronous, and digital synchronous like we're doing. The question then is, do different price points make sense? And more, I think, it seems to me, we might be headed toward probably a more moderate price point that is defensible across modalities. Because your other alternative, which is kind of a menu of price points, which is sort of where we are, I just don't see it necessarily surviving. We're working on different options here. Unfortunately, a lot of them are driving down the revenue. So especially during this pandemic. So the question will be whether we don't end up, knocking the bottom out of higher education because people just simply conclude, I'm not going to pay premium for online learning or digital or synchronous Zoom-based learning. But if your programs aren't looking at digital in a significant way, you've got to get going on it, because I think it's here to stay, but it might be here in a kind of a hybrid way, hopefully, because the face-to-face is really important.
Well, we now have about 10 minutes, and I'd like to give each panelist an opportunity to say any concluding comments or anything to leave us with as we think about this. And if there's also any open question that you still would like to answer, please feel free to do that as well. But
I think I'd conclude just by saying, don't panic. Most of you have been through something before that deals with your budget. Think about it as a rational decision that you will have to make beyond your dean's office, up the chain. And so provide the best evidence that you can of why your program is important, how it gives to the university now, and how it will in the future. And really spend some time with your faculty answering those questions and your other stakeholders. your students, your former students, your staff. Make sure that you can answer those questions and that everybody is sort of breathing them as the dogma that they share, because it's much easier to make the case if the plan is really alive and part of the dialogue.
So we haven't talked about budget beyond what your institutional budget is, but I do want to touch on the experience for our students. Many of their internships have been drying up, that paid opportunities are becoming much more limited, and I really encourage planning programs to focus on your relationships with those planning departments and look at opportunities for micro experiences, micro internships, smaller bite-sized projects that students may be able to take on and do remotely, so that our students are developing the experiences they need and feeling like they're getting a high value from the education that they're getting. And so I just think about the financial needs of our students, that they're going to be experiencing higher levels of financial need as a result of not having as many paid opportunities during their academic programs. And so just be thinking about that as well as thinking about the internal budgeting.
Point of view, and this point was briefly touched upon, but the truth of the matter is that in state institutions, we will be receiving less funding. And with this pandemic or without it, that was going to be the trend anyway. So I think it's not what the faculty would like to hear sometimes, but I've talked to several of my faculty, and I have told them that I hope and I expect them to become a more integral part of the fundraising effort. And a faculty member should be, if a faculty member is comfortable enough to present at a conference, at a specialized conference, and do a good job, same faculty member should be able to present in front of our alumni board or Dean's Advisory Council. And I think most of us, and I certainly speak for my school, we have very dedicated alumni, and people are genuinely concerned that the college they love actually is going to be hurt by this. And actually we've had a very good fundraising year, regardless of the fact that the last couple of months have been very difficult and development staff has been told not to initially engage in these conversations. I mean, there are a lot of people who care about what we do. And I think it's reasonable. This is going to be part of the permanent shift that our faculty members and sometimes our students have to become comfortable with the idea that in addition to what they thought they do, they also have to be able to present their idea to an outside audience and actually help raise money. And I don't think that's a bad thing. That's a good skill for all of us to have, and one small solution potentially to the future.
I guess I'd just make 2 points. The first is that, and I see a couple of comments in the chat. One thing I like to emphasize to faculty is, when you're having to listen to people like Provost, it can get really annoying because they're always talking about some of the issues both Jennifer and I have been talking about around enrollments and budgets and things like that. I just want to stress that, what is really at issue here is, in the bigger scheme, is that we need a redoubled effort in the United States to focus on public higher education in particular, and to properly resource it. And the states need to get out and realize that these public institutions, big, especially the large research institutions and so on, are making major contributions to their economies. So when you hear us saying, okay, you guys got to worry about enrollment, or you got to worry about your budget bottom line, et cetera, your net contribution to the university, and so on, don't assume that we necessarily share the view that this is a wonderful situation to be in. And a lot of us are working hard too on the bigger question, which is, how do we properly support public higher education and make sure it is accessible to the broadest cross-section of the population? And we're not in a good place in that regard in the US. So none of this is to excuse the sorry state, for example, of state funding for its higher education sector as it's evolved particularly out of the recession. So I just wanted to emphasize that point. Last point I'd make is, for those of you who are department heads, thank you for what you do. I was a department head, I was a dean, I was a provost. Yours is the hardest job. I can tell you, just haven't done them. And right now you're on the front line. So I just want to say, this is an unprecedented situation, and I just, from my standpoint here at OSU, I'm so grateful for all of our leadership all the way up and down the chain during this time. It will pass. It will get through it. But just thank you for being willing to do these jobs, because the discipline of city planning really needs the work you're doing right now.
Well, thank you. And I very much appreciate that, kind of ending and really thinking about doubling down on public education. And if any panelist has a last comment, please jump in. But unfortunately, I wish I could unmute everyone so we could thank the panelists, but please thank them in the chat, and do accept our sincerest thanks for thinking through all these, during this time when I know that we're all thinking about our programs and the work we do, and the real commitment we have, and wonderful students who are doing amazing things and that we want to continue to support. So thank you for taking the time to do this. For anyone, this was recorded and it will be available. The link will be available through ACSP, and there is a link to the last webinar, which was focusing on the planning discipline and how to think about it in this era. So anyway, once again, thank you all very much, and I hope that all the panelists see the chat and the thank you from everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Renia.
Thank you. Well, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for participating.
I'm really, I have no idea. I guess it's just the two of us. I don't know what happened. I'm actually on my daughter's computer. That's why it worked.
It's Zoom is one of those things that it's, given how much we use it, it's remarkably reliable, but when it's not, you feel so stuck because you're counting on it.
You need it. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for participating. Yeah.